Hello. You know what a horse is, don't you? There are different sorts of horse. There are swift, smooth ones, which we call race horses. And there are big, heavy ones with long, shaggy hair. We call them cart horses. But did you know that there's another sort of horse altogether that lives in the water? I've got one here. He's called a seahorse. Look, he's got a long nose, just like a horse. He's got a long mane all the way down his back, just like a horse. And yet he isn't really a horse at all. He's a sea creature. Now, on board Mr. Noah's Ark, there weren't any sea creatures because all the water was outside the Ark. But in the water outside the Ark, there were hundreds and thousands of them, not just seahorses. There were fishes. And just as on the Ark there were enormous creatures like the elephants and the hippopotamuses and middling-sized ones and small ones, so in the water out there, there were huge great sea creatures like whales and middling fishes like herrings and little tiny weeny ones like minnows. You remember that on the Ark there were some very fierce big animals, but Mr. Noah was there to keep them in order. Outside the Ark in the water it was quite different. There were some terrible fierce creatures there too, and there was no Mr. Noah to look after them. And worst of all of them was this one. He's called a shark. And a shark is a terrifying fish with a great big ugly mouth and teeth, lots and lots of sharp, wicked teeth. And a wicked little eye. He's a horrible creature, a shark, and this story is called Crockle Takes a Swim. The sun was blazing down, and it was a fine, hot afternoon. All round the Ark, the water sparkled. High above, the birds from the Ark flew merrily round and all the people and the animals on board were making the most of the lovely weather. At one end of the warm deck, the animals, large and small, sprawled and slept happily. At the other end, the family were all enjoying themselves in different ways. Mrs. Noah had brought her plants out to water them. Her youngest son, Japhet, was playing deck quoits with his friend Janet, and even gloomy Mr. and Mrs. Shem were doing their best to sunbathe. Cheerful Mrs. Ham was trying to catch fish for supper. They were all having a lot of fun, even though the quoit landed in the wrong place, and Mrs. Ham caught Mrs. Shem's bonnet once instead of a mackerel. Crockle, the pet baby crocodile, who shouldn't have been on the Ark at all, was sitting on the side looking at the cool water and longing to have a swim. In fact, the only people indoors were Mr. Noah, who was busy working in his study, and his son Ham the carpenter, who was banging and hammering deep down inside the Ark. Nobody, except his father, Mr. Noah, knew exactly what he was up to. When Japhet and Janet had finished their game, they felt hot and tired. Like Crockle, they wanted a swim. Then out came Mr. Noah. "Please, father, can we go in the water?" asked Japhet. "No, children, it is quite impossible," said Mr. Noah, and he put up a big notice which said, "No bathing." "But why not?" said Janet. "Now listen," said Mr. Noah. "However fierce the animals are, on board the Ark they all do what I say. But out there under the deep water there are creatures who have nothing to do with the Ark. They are dangerous and I cannot control them. Come down below. If Ham has finished his work, you will understand better." So Mr. and Mrs. Noah and Mrs. Ham and Japhet and Janet went down deep into the great hull of the Ark. And there was Ham, very pleased with himself. He had built a great glass window in the side of the ark below the level of the water. Through the window, the family could see strange fishes gathering outside. "Goodness," said Japhet, "I had no idea there were so many living things in the water." "There are a lot more than those," said Mr. Noah. "Just watch." And as they watched, they saw flatfish and fatfish, shellfish and jellyfish, and a horrible, ugly octopus. Just then, Mr. and Mrs. Shem came down. "I've put a new mirror up," said Ham. "Take a look." Well, just at that moment there happened to be two very ugly fish looking in, so when Mr. and Mrs. Shem looked in the glass, they had a shock. They thought they were looking at themselves. Ham laughed. "Ha, ha, ha, don't worry, it isn't really a mirror," he said. "It's a window for looking out under the water." By this time, some of the animals had come down to see what was going on. So the animals looked at the fishes, and the fishes looked at the animals. They were all very surprised. None of them had ever seen anything like each other before. Then Japhet and Janet suddenly saw something which wasn't a fish, or indeed any sort of sea creature. "Hey, look!" shouted Japhet. "It's Crockle!" cried Janet. And so it was, Crockle. The naughty baby crocodile had waited until he was left all alone on deck. Then he dived in to have a swim, and now he was showing off outside the water window. "Come back, you bad crocodile!" shouted Japhet. But Crockle couldn't hear him through the glass. Anyway, he was enjoying himself too much as he looped the loop and did every kind of trick. He was just doing a daring nosedive when suddenly he looked up. A look of terror came over his face, and a moment later he was off, closely followed by an enormous shark. "It'll gobble him up," shouted Ham. "What can we do to help?" cried Japhet. "Nothing down here," said Mr. Noah. "All up on deck." So they all rushed up the stairs to try to save poor Crockle. When everybody got up on deck, they saw that Crockle had reached the surface. All they could see of the shark was its big, dark, frightening fin. And it was getting closer, and closer, and closer. Crockle was swimming for his life. Ham seized a lifebelt. "Don't throw it until I say," ordered Mr. Noah. "And the rest of you, shout and roar and make as much noise as you can to distract the shark." So all the people and animals yelled and cheered and made a great noise. When the shark lifted its ugly head out of the water to put an end to Crockle, it was deafened. But Crockle was getting tired. "Now!" shouted Noah, and Ham threw the lifebelt as hard and as far as he could towards the baby crocodile. The shark was nearly there. Its sharp teeth were just about to close on Crockle. Ham's aim was good. With a last desperate effort, Crockle was just able to jump into the lifebelt. Then, with a mighty tug, Ham plucked it, Crockle and all, out of the water. And the shark's great mouth snapped shut on nothing. "Oh, well done, Ham!" cried the children. Crockle was safe, and a moment later he was back on board again. Then everybody made a fuss of him. Mrs. Ham gave him a bowl of tasty soup to make him strong. Mrs. Shem gave him a knitted scarf to keep him warm, and even gloomy old Shem himself tickled his tummy. Mr. Noah usually pretended that Crockle wasn't there because he had already two perfectly good, or bad, crocodiles on the ark. But now he patted him quite kindly on the head. "Even so," he said, "it was very naughty. After all, I did put up a notice saying, 'No bathing.'" "I know," said Japhet, "but surely, Father, even the cleverest baby crocodiles can't read." Well, that's the end of Crockle Takes a Swim. It's lucky Ham was there with the lifebelt, isn't it? We all have to be careful when we go swimming, especially in the sea. I think Crockle will be more careful next time, but you never know. We'll see next week. Until then, goodbye.